Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Today's video is going to be about um, lipids. So the title of our notes, we are going to call these notes lipids. And lipids are a biomolecule that is one of the four major organic biomolecules. And this is an important one. Lipids are otherwise known as our fats and our oils. And so we all know about fats. And we all know about oils. So fats are things like, you know, you look at it in the labels of your food, but they're things like butter and the fat on your bacon. And our oils are a liquid, and we usually use them for cooking, especially when we cook like donuts and they're deep fried. Delicious. Okay, so lipids are one of the biomolecules, and so they are made of pieces, and those pieces are called monomers. And so in a lipid, there are two monomers, and they're different from each other. So far, we've been talking about different biomolecules, and their pieces are all the same. But lipids have two different monomers. Okay, and so one of them, I'm going to color code this, is called a glycerol. So I'm going to put monomers for lipids are a glycerol and a fatty acid and fatty acid tails. Not a, but multiple fatty acid tails. Okay, so those are the two components that make up a lipid. Let me draw this for you, and then I will show you a picture. So a glycerol is a 3-carboned piece. So there's 3 carbons, and there are hydrogens and oxygens attached to it. Okay, I'm not going to draw that because in the picture it gets kind of messy. Plus, I don't really expect you to know, all the carbons and hydrogens. But you should always assume that carbons have oxygens and hydrogens attached to them. Okay, normally we just focus on the carbons because they're just like the star of the show, but there's always hydrogens and oxygens around. Okay, so the glycerol is just a 3-carbon molecule, and then the fatty acid tails are a long chain of carbons. Okay, so this glycerol makes up one piece, and then the fatty acid tails, on this one I'm going to draw 3 tails, and I'm going to draw it in red. And so this carbon is attached to another carbon, and that's attached to another carbon, and I'm putting them in this zigzag fashion. That's typically how we draw it. And again, I want you to keep in mind that all carbons are bound to 4 different atoms. So when I draw this fatty acid tail like this, you should always assume that each carbon has 4 things attached to it. Okay, so the glycerol has oxygens and hydrogens attached to it, but these carbons here have just hydrogens. So each carbon has 2 hydrogens attached to it like this. And you can see how this could just get really hard to draw after a while. So a lot of times people will either just leave the carbon by itself or they'll write CH2. Okay, so that's kind of a shortcut in having to draw all those hydrogens. So the glycerol is this blue part. This is one fatty acid tail, but each carbon has a fatty acid tail. And so I'm just going to draw it as a zigzag line. Each corner represents a carbon, okay? And so this carbon also has a fatty acid tail. So there are 3 fatty acid tails here. And so this is an example of a lipid. This example is specifically called triglyceride. So I'm going to write that down. Let's see, let's do black. This is a triglyceride. And it's called a triglyceride because it has 3 fatty acid tails. Okay, so I'm going to show you a picture of this. It's just not a fancy picture, but it just kind of gives you another model of what it looks like. Let's see here. Hang on, let me grab my picture. I don't see it. Here it is. Okay, so here is a simple picture of a triglyceride. And I want to point out that this is the glycerol here. And the glycerol has these 3 carbons, which I drew right here in the blue. And then attached to those are oxygens and hydrogens. You don't have to know how all that works. And then there are 3 fatty acid tails, which are just composed of lots of carbons. Okay, so each corner represents a carbon. Each carbon has to be attached to 4 things. So it's either going to be attached to another carbon or some hydrogens. Okay, the carbon on the end has 3 hydrogens because there are 3 loose ends. Okay, so this is called a triglyceride, and it is a lipid, and this is a lipid that is used for storing energy. So we talked about carbohydrates in a past video, and carbohydrates are also stored energy. Our bodies are evolved to break down carbohydrates easier. So your body can very easily break down a carbohydrate to get energy, as you're like running your race or doing whatever you're doing, any exercise you're doing, or just whatever, just living your life. It's going to take the carbohydrates first because they're easier. But fat, like a triglyceride, has more energy per fat. And so once the carbohydrates run out, then they're going to start using the fats for your energy storage. And so that's why we store fat on our bodies, is for stored energy for later. In case we run out of food, then we have some stored food in our body. And it is in the form of this triglyceride. Okay, so I want to point out that these fatty acid tails come in 2 different forms, okay? And I want to point out that in this picture, I have a carbon with 2 hydrogens, a carbon with 2 hydrogens, and all of these are carbons with 2 hydrogens, okay? So I want to point out that sometimes there are less hydrogens than what are allowed, okay? So if all the hydrogens are fully bound to all the carbons, it is called a saturated fat. Okay, so let me write this down. A saturated fat is one that has all the possible hydrogens on the carbons in the fatty acid tails. Okay, saturated fat has all the possible hydrogens on the carbons on the fatty acid tails. Okay, so what that means is that all the carbons are saturated with hydrogens. So I'm going to draw a little picture here just to give you a better idea. This is just for one of the tails, or 2 or 3, okay? But if one of the tails has all the hydrogens, then it's considered saturated. So let me just draw a carbon, and let's say there's 2 hydrogens on it. And then I'm going to draw another carbon. There's 2 hydrogens, another carbon, 2 hydrogens, okay, and so on. So if the whole tail has all the hydrogens possible, it is called saturated. Whoops, it goes like this. And so the opposite is true too. If not all the hydrogens are attached, then it is called unsaturated. Okay, so the opposite is also possible. An unsaturated fat, let's write this down, is one where not all the hydrogens are present. When less than the total number of possible hydrogens, less than the total number of possible hydrogens are present on a fatty acid tail. Oops, on a fatty acid tail. Okay, So let me explain, or let me draw it. So the saturated fat is this one, where all the carbons have all the possible hydrogens. I'm going to draw another tail here, and I'm going to say one carbon has 2 hydrogens, another carbon has 2 hydrogens, and then I'm going to say this carbon has only 1 hydrogen. And so because each carbon has to have 4 bonds to it, it's going to have a double bond to the next hydrogen. So this carbon is only going to have 1 hydrogen. Okay, and then that's going to be bound to the next carbon. Let's say this has 2 hydrogens and this carbon has 2 hydrogens. Okay, this one here is considered the unsaturated fat. And that is because it has less hydrogens than possible. And that is because of this double bond here between 2 carbons. And the double bond just means that the 2 carbons are sharing 2 electrons to each other. That's possible. And that happens. And so a saturated fat is one where all the hydrogens are there. There are no double bonds between carbons. And an unsaturated fat is when not all the hydrogens are saturating the fat, and there's a double bond between some of the carbons, okay? If there's a double bond in any of the fatty acid tails, the fat is now considered an unsaturated fat. Okay, let me tell you what happens when you have an unsaturated fat. Okay, so earlier I showed you a triglyceride, so I'm gonna draw that again. A triglyceride has a glycerol, and then it has fatty acid tails, okay? And this is just a representation of the carbon-hydrogen chain. And so this one, let's say, is saturated. This one is saturated. And let's say this third one is unsaturated, okay? And so when there is a double bond, let me put the double bond here. It's drawn like this. And so what happens is it changes the shape of that fatty acid tail. What happens is it like kicks its leg up, just like it's shown here. Instead of the leg being straight up and down, now it's kicking. Okay, and so what results in this configuration is now there's going to be some space in between the different fats. Okay, so let me show you, for example. I'm just going to draw a circle for the glycerol, and then I'm just going to draw the tails. I'm sorry, there's a glycerol, and here's the tails. I'm just going to draw them as straight lines. Okay, say this is a saturated fat, so all the tails are straight up and down. Let's put another fat that's saturated and another fat that's saturated. And so these fats that have saturated tails can get really close together like sardines. And these saturated fats, because they get really close together like sardines, are solid at room temperature. So this is what butter is, solid at room temp. Okay? And butter at room temperature is a solid. Saturated fats are the fats that are not good for you, and that's because they can get really compact like that, and they can plug up your blood vessels, and that could be a problem because then you could have a heart attack, which is why you don't want to eat a whole bunch of saturated fats. Okay, a little bit's fine, but not too much. Okay, if you have fats that are unsaturated, so I'm going to draw this here. The ball represents the glycerol, these represents the tails, and I'm drawing some that are unsaturated, and see how they're kicking its neighbor. So I'm going to put another one here. It's going to kick that neighbor. This one's going to kick that neighbor. They're like kind of dancing around. Okay. And because they have little legs that are kicking out, it's spreading them out further apart. And because there's more room for them to move, they are liquid at room temperature. Okay. And so these are what our oils are. Okay, these are what our oils are because our oils are liquid at room temperature, and the oils are healthier fats than the solid fats like butter and the fat on your bacon. Okay, so that's what a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat is. Okay, so far we've talked about triglyceride is one example of a lipid, and we talked about how some triglycerides are saturated, some triglycerides are unsaturated. Triglycerides are storage for energy, okay? So the last thing I want to do before I end this video is I want to introduce to you another lipid. And this is an important one for biology. This is called a phospholipid. Oops, phospholipid. Oh, that, okay. Phospholipid. This is just another example. Okay. The first example I gave you was a triglyceride, and this is a second example of a lipid. Okay. A phospholipid is this. There is a glycerol, like always, okay? Because all lipids have two monomers. One is glycerol and the other one is the fatty acid tails. A phospholipid has the glycerol with the 3 carbons, okay? Then it only has 2 fatty acid tails. So I'm going to draw the fatty acid tails like this. Okay, so it only has 2 because on the 3rd carbon, there is what we call a phosphate group. And I'm just going to draw it with a P and a circle around it. Okay, this is a phosphate group. Okay, that's a phosphate group. This is the glycerol. And these are the fatty acid tails. And these fatty acid tails are unsaturated. So they kick up. Okay, they kick their legs up and they are liquid at room temperature. Liquid, I'm just going to say liquidy oil. Okay, so these are liquidy oils. Okay, so a phospholipid is important because we're going to talk more about this coming up, but in your cells, you have what is called a membrane. All membranes are made of phospholipids. Okay, so I'm going to write this down. This is a very important point that we're going to go into in the future. So all membranes in cells are made of phospholipids. Okay, and so I want to point out two things. One is that this glycerol head loves water and the tails hate water. Okay, so this is a very important property of lipids. Okay, so the glycerol head, which is the glycerol with the phosphate group, it loves water. We call this hydrophilic. Hydro meaning water, philic meaning love. And then the fatty acid tails hate water. Hates water. This is called hydrophobic. Okay, so this is what a phospholipid looks like. All the membranes in our cells are made of phospholipids. And so before I let you go, I just want to draw a picture of a membrane, okay? All our cells have a skin on the outside that is made of like an oil. Okay, it's not skin like our skin, which is solid. It's an oil skin, which is kind of weird to think about, but it's actually very handy because with a solid, if I were to like stab it, it would go through my skin, right? But if it was an oil, if I were to stab it, it doesn't go through. Okay, so it's very useful that our cell membranes are made of an oil layer. But I want to draw for you what a membrane would look like. So our skin of the cell is called a membrane, and then there are parts inside the cell that have membranes too. But I'm just going to draw an example of a cell, okay? And so a cell you always think of as kind of like a circle. And so I'm going to draw phospholipids like this. Okay, so here are the heads. Phospholipids only have 2 tails. Okay, this is going to take me a little while, but just hang in there with me, okay? So I'm just going to draw this really quickly, like this. So here are all the heads of the phospholipids, okay? And I'm drawing the membrane of a cell. Okay, it's going to be in a circular form. Not all cells are circular, but this one is. Okay, so then we have the phosphate tails, phospholipid tails going inward. But then what happens is there's another layer of phospholipids, okay? So then there's going to be a second layer, and the heads are going to be on the inside, and the tails are going to be sticking out. Okay, so this is what a membrane looks like for your cells. And this is because your cells live in like a water environment. Okay, your body is made of water. And so all your cells are kind of in a watery environment. All the heads love water. So there's water. I'm going to put H2O on the inside of your cells, and there's water on the outside of your cells. And so all the heads love water. So the outside layer is touching the water, and the inside layer is touching the water. There's not very much water on the inside of the membrane. This membrane is called a phospholipid bilayer. So membranes, these are all membranes, are a phospholipid bilayer. Which means that they are made of phospholipids and they're made of 2 layers of phospholipids. Okay, and so let me pull up a picture for you so you can see what I'm talking about. Phospholipid right here. Okay, so let me show you this picture. This is a cartoon picture, okay? And what you can see here is this is a phospholipid. Phospholipid has this head, which is the glycerol. So here's 1 carbon, 2 carbon, 3 carbon. One of the carbons has this phosphate group attached to it. That's what's here, okay? That's all you have to know is that one of the carbons has a phosphate group. The other 2 carbons has the fatty acid tails. The tails are unsaturated, which means there's going to be a double bond between some of the carbons, which causes the legs to kick out, which causes it to be an oil layer, okay? This is what a phospholipid bilayer looks like. The heads are on the outside touching the water, and the tails are touching each other, okay? And that's because on the outside of the cell, there's water, and on the inside of the cell, there's water. Okay, I hope that wasn't too much for you, and I hope you're having a great day, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.